Thank you, Sabina. So, I have to say this was an interesting exercise. You always think you know about your own country and then discover how little you actually do know or how hard it is to get some information. So, first, some thanks to two people who helped me, James Parry at the UK Research Integrity Office and Peter Upton, who was my research assistant on this. So, some facts and figures, which I think help put it into context. 65 million people, a GDP of around nearly $3 trillion, working out at a GDP per head of about nearly $44,000. I left things in dollars if they were reported in dollars, some are in pounds. The exchange rate, but in the time I was doing it, changed, so that's actually an issue. Spending on R&D. This, I found the definition very broad, so it included all sorts of innovation in pharmaceutical companies, in the motor industry, and all sorts, so it's definitely not just academia here. And that apparently is around £30 billion, which works out at about 1.7% of GDP. I also found various things that sort of confirmed this, and there was a useful report from the US NSF, which was also looking at GDP, so some similar comparisons there. Research institutions, we have 133 universities, all publicly funded, so that's a bit different from many countries, and about 30 government research institutions, probably around 200 research and innovation institutions. And again, I think our government tends to give a rather generous definition of that. So any company that is involved in product development gets included as doing research. So it's actually very hard to quantify that private sector research and their contribution. In terms of researchers, we think, again, it's difficult to know if we're talking about those in the academic field or the private sector, but 277,000, around 109,000 postgraduates. It gets easier if you look just at the universities, and 126,000 academic staff at institutions, who you will assume most of them will be engaged in research. Where does the money come from? So about 65% is considered to be private funding coming from business, 7% direct government funding. This is something I completely don't understand, although I found the figure. The government funds the institutions, so what does higher education mean, actually? I really don't know. And 2% charities. Output, over 97,000 journal articles, according to the World Bank. Regulation and guidance, this is something where I do feel more confident that I'm perhaps telling the truth. We apparently have, I didn't know this, we have a national science and innovation strategy. It's had that much effect on me. We haven't had one for this particular government, though. That was last produced by our coalition government in 2014. The current government hasn't produced one, and I'd never seen it until I discovered it. We have no official funded national bodies on research integrity and no bodies that do investigations, but we do have the UK RIO, the UK Research Integrity Office. It's a charity, it has no government funding, and it is purely advisory. Research ethics, which mainly in healthcare is nationally organised. There are also levels within institutions as well. In terms of strategy for research integrity, we do have the Concordat to support research integrity, which was launched in 2012 with support from Universities UK, which is the umbrella group of UK universities, and the major funders. Now, I'm rather critical of this. I think what it says is excellent, but it has completely not been implemented and lacked teeth. And I'm greatly relieved that it's not just me who can report on the fact that it's not being implemented. They did a progress report last year, and they found that, for example, one of the requirements was that each institution should post an annual statement about research integrity, and in fact, less than 30% of institutions had done that. This is 5 years on from the launch. A very simple, and I would have thought low cost and low risk thing. It asks universities to have a research integrity contact person and to include their details on a website. Only 37% of UK universities have done that, which I think is frankly pathetic. And having some learning materials about research integrity on the website. That's not actually a recommendation of the Concordat, but I guess it's a nice to have, and a sort of indication of the investment or lack of it that we do have. Again, only 23% of the British universities. So although we have this Concordat, it's actually rather poorly complied with and very little sort of teeth behind it. Research integrity investigations take place entirely at the institutional level. We have no overarching bodies, no umbrella organisations, no national bodies at all, or even any national guidance. So although UK Rio has produced guidance on how to do a misconduct investigation, as I say, it's purely voluntary. It's not an official guidance. I have to say also the academic sector is highly resistant to any suggestion of regulation. And one of the reasons that UK Rio has sort of stayed low-key and charitable and so on is that any time it suggests that maybe it should do more, it's told firmly to get back in its box. And no, we don't need that, thank you very much. We don't have a problem. There is no formal requirement for training in responsible conduct of research. There is no formal requirement for having a research integrity officer, although the Concordat does recommend this. So there are the recommendations from the Concordat, but they are purely voluntary. And the individual institutions are very strong and have so far succeeded in lobbying to say that it would be appalling if they were regulated in any way. In terms of research assessment, we have something called the Research Excellence Framework, and that determines the amount of money that goes to the different universities. So it's obviously very important, and it's based on research output, i.e. publications. There's various discussions around the amount of sort of personal peer review as opposed to bibliometrics, and it varies with different cycles of the REF, but basically they are counting publications, and although they claim they don't, there is some emphasis on impact factor as well. The Higher Education Funding Council for England, which is not a funding body, it doesn't fund research projects, but it funds the research infrastructure, so it actually pays for the universities to have heating and lighting and so on. It is being replaced by something called Research England, so we're in a slight state of flux. However, HEFCE, when it did exist, was actually really the only body that put the Concordat as a requirement. So if you wanted the money from HEFCE to turn the lights on, you were meant to be complying with the Concordat. So that was helpful. However, we don't know, going ahead, quite what Research England will be doing. And also, although it said it required this compliance, it was rather vague, and I never heard of anybody being told you can't get funding or we don't like what you're doing, and it was a complete lack of transparency as to whether they were being compliant or not. The research environment, apparently around 30% of science PhD graduates go on to postdoctoral research positions. One caveat as well, when I talk about numbers of people involved in research and innovation, I do get the impression that that's very often science. It's not necessarily academic research, humanities research, and so on. That seems harder to find information about. Around 4% get permanent academic positions. We have a rather different system. We don't have this formal tenure track as you do in the US, but there's certainly intense competition for places, a lot of people living on short-term grants. Grant success for national funders, I found it very hard to get any global information from that, but a couple of individual ones that did publish. So our Engineering and Physical Science Research Council said grant success was around 30%, and about the same for the Environmental Research Council. I couldn't find any details of the numbers of people who were doing research into research integrity. Various laws, despite the fact that we have nothing, the Concordat is voluntary, various laws that do have implications for research integrity, but they tend to be fairly tangential. So the central ethics system for our National Health Service, as I say, the HEFCE requirements are probably the closest thing that we had to something that related to that. Then there are things such as a Data Protection Act, a Human Tissue Act, which might have implications on certain types of research. The EU Clinical Trials Directive, although I think we interpret it in a slightly different way from other countries. And there is quite tightly protected animal research legislation on what you can and can't do there. So this is the completely subjective bit, which I hope the rest was more factual, but this really now is my own sort of personal opinions. I think the independents, the institutions are strong but very independent, and they have, I would like to say politely, a variable research integrity infrastructure. I think some of them are way behind the times, some of them are probably doing quite well. It's incredibly hard to find out. There is very little transparency about misconduct investigations. So although this was something that the Concordat promoted, it has not happened. We cannot find out, even if an investigation has taken place. There is no national body collecting this information. That's something that I find very disappointing. And there is extremely strong resistance to any further regulation. As I say, no national body, and the Concordat, it's a very nice piece of paper, and what it says is very nice, but it's actually had rather little effect. Thank you.